Good afternoon, everybody. We're just about to start the next session, which is focusing on key biodiversity area conservation in a post-2020 world. So very warm welcome to everybody that's joined us today in the room and everybody who's joining us remotely online. Thank you so much for joining. We have a focus today on the importance of identifying KBAs. And we're going to hear some great examples. We're going to take a journey, if you like, in terms of some work on KBA identification, ranging from work in South Africa, Australia, Canada, and Mozambique. And we have interspersed a number of presentations from colleagues online, some video messages, and also the last segment will be focusing on a panel discussion with the panelists you see before you at the front here. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Andrew Plumptree, who is head of the Key Biodiversity Areas Secretariat. And he's going to start the proceedings by talking us through a little bit more about what KBAs are about and why they are so relevant to a post-2020 world. Thank you. Andy.
Can we have the first presentation, please? Great. So the Convention on Biological Diversity had a target between 2010 and 2020, Aichi Target 11, that at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity, etc., etc. Most of you know about that target. The results of that target were fairly successful compared to other Aichi targets in that we got pretty close to 17% protection of terrestrial areas, less for marine. But many of these protected areas were biased towards locations that were remote and less suitable for agriculture, so they weren't always in the right place. And the science is also showing that in 2010, about 25% of protected areas covered KBAs, and now only about 18 to 19% of protected areas covered KBAs. So actually, it's showing that protection isn't necessarily targeting these key biodiversity areas, which are sites of importance for global biodiversity. And another study showed that there could have been a 37-fold improvement in the number of species protected if places had been better sited when the protected areas had been sited. So a percentage target on its own won't necessarily halt species extinction. If you compare the current language in Target 3 of the first version of the Global Biodiversity Framework, I've put both of them side by side up there. You can see that the wording's almost identical, except the percentage is different. Most of the text that's up there still talks about areas of particular importance for biodiversity and the same sort of other things that need to be in there, but the focus on Aichi was always on the percentage. And there's a big danger that we're going to find ourselves in the next 10 years, we'll have increased the percentage, but it won't necessarily have been in these areas of particular importance for biodiversity. So KBAs came out of a process which took a long time to come up with the criteria. They were discussed between about 2010 and 2016 and involved the conservation community around the world. They're defined as sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. And the global standard for the identification of KBAs was published in 2016. And at the same time, the KBA partnership was formed, which is now made up of 13 of the leading nature conservation organizations. And you can see the logos at the bottom of the screen there. KBA criteria try to capture the different things that conservationists are concerned about. So threatened biodiversity, geographically restricted biodiversity, and both of these can be threatened ecosystems or threatened species, and geographically restricted species or geographically restricted ecosystems. Then thirdly, the large sites of ecological integrity, where you still have fully functioning large predators, large herbivores, and a complement of species. And fourth one is biological processes, where you're getting congregations of species, such as important nesting areas or important spawning areas, or areas where species might find refuge, say, during a period of drought. And then finally, sites of irreplaceability, where if you're setting a certain amount that you want to conserve of a species, you can't find anywhere else where you can conserve them. You have to be conserving in those sites. And collectively, the criteria aim to capture all the various ways the conservation community values biodiversity. KBAs are identified at a national level. They're identified by countries in different parts of the world, and they're being used to expand protected area networks. Donors are using them to decide where they're going to invest, and the private sector, as we'll hear later, is also using KBAs to minimize their risk. There's a world database of key biodiversity areas, which currently holds data on 16,343 of those areas, and they're spread around the world, as you can see from that map. That's available on the website, and anyone can access these data and find out more about each of the sites and what are the species that trigger KBA status at the sites. KBAs should be an important part of any national spatial plan. There's actually a motion which was approved for this Conservation Congress, Motion 96, which is all about strengthening the national spatial planning to ensure the global persistence of biodiversity. And in that, KBAs are identified as being an important component of any national spatial plan because they bring a global focus to spatial planning. So in order to qualify as a KBA, you have to assess the global distribution of a species or global distribution of an ecosystem, and there has to be above a certain threshold amount in a site to qualify as a KBA for most of the criteria. Or it needs to be a site of ecological integrity. If we're going to mainstream biodiversity across government sectors, spatial planning is critical for that. If you don't know where things are, you can't plan your roads and your infrastructure and your agriculture and all these other things that we want to know about. And we'll be hearing in one of the presentations, particularly in South Africa and Mozambique, where they're moving the KBAs into their national spatial planning processes. There's also a website. You'll hear a little bit more about that when our second presenter presents, that provides information about the KBAs. So in this session now, we're going to look at a series of presentations. As Mel said, the first one will be tools to help apply KBA criteria. And then we'll hear from 4 countries where they're making national assessments of their KBAs. And then we'll hear from the International Finance Corporation about how it's using KBAs to minimize risk. We're now going to move, though, before any of these speakers come up, to a video about KBAs that has been produced by Rewild. So I'll shut up now and we'll move on to that video. Thank you.
While all wild places are important, when it comes to the diversity of life on Earth, not all wild places are considered equal. There are some places, in rainforests and reefs, peatlands and prairies, oceans and rivers, lakes and wetlands, that are unique for the species, ecosystems, and genetic diversity that they harbor. Some provide critical habitat for threatened species, even those that may live across broader ranges. Others are home to wildlife species or ecosystems so rare or restricted to such small areas that the destruction of even a single stream or patch of forest would all but guarantee their extinction or collapse. Others still are healthy ecosystems that are able to support a diversity and abundance of wildlife and the natural processes, like predator and prey relationships and wild river systems that are critical in supporting life. These special places, called Key Biodiversity Areas, are not only vital to ensuring that biodiversity persists on our planet, but are often a source of food, water, medicine, and livelihoods for indigenous people and local communities, and offer some of the most effective nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. As individual countries aim to meet their sustainable development goals and other global commitments, and as we look ahead at a new global framework for nature, at how to equitably protect and conserve the right 30% of wildlands, inland waters, and oceans by 2030, how to prevent extinctions and future pandemics, how to maintain our planet's biodiversity, how to slow and halt the warming of the planet before we reach the catastrophic point of no return. There is no better blueprint than that provided by Key Biodiversity Areas, or KBAs. The Key Biodiversity Area Partnership is an ambitious alliance of 13 global conservation organizations that have come together to help identify, map, monitor, and conserve KBAs. The partnership helps provide a standardized and collaborative process for local and national organizations interested in identifying their KBAs so that conservationists, lawmakers, businesses, indigenous peoples, and local communities can prioritize safeguarding these vital wildlands and waters. The identification of a KBA can help guide stakeholder decisions about where to create new protected areas and how best to manage the land and water, where to avoid development or minimize risk from industry and business, and how best to implement and monitor important biodiversity goals. More than 16,000 KBAs worldwide have already been identified and mapped, home to critical populations of more than 13,000 species, ensuring that biodiversity conservation happens more efficiently and in the most important places. And that is the key, in the most important places. If we don't protect the right 30% of the planet by 2030, we will undoubtedly continue losing biodiversity. There is no question about it. We must focus our efforts on identifying new KBAs and conserving those that have already been mapped for animals, plants, fungi, and people, for the diversity of all life on Earth.
Thank you. So we're now going to move on to another presentation that's from Daniele Baicero, who works for the KBA Secretariat with me based in Cambridge. He is going to talk to us about different tools that various members of the KBA partnership have been working on developing that will help in the identification of key biodiversity areas. Welcome, Daniele.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andy. Key biodiversity areas are meant to be a bottom-up process. The experts on the ground are the ones who really know where the important biodiversity elements are. And here we'll present some of the tools that the partnership has developed to help you, the experts, propose the key biodiversity areas that can then be ratified. I'm going to go through a series of slides presenting some tools, including how to obtain information on key biodiversity areas, the tools that we have developed to help you apply and understand the criteria, to help during the proposal process for key biodiversity areas, and to help you understand where in your region of interest you are more likely to find these sites. First of all, we have the Key Biodiversity Areas website, which has been published in 2020, just 1 year ago. Here you will find all of the information in these tools. And foremost, you will have a dashboard where we present with 3 updates yearly, all of these sites that have currently been ratified. Currently, we have 16,000 sites that cover about 21 million square kilometers across the whole world. You are able to explore this map, learn statistics about the sites in your region. You are able to search for individual sites that you may be interested in and find information on what the sites are, why they were ratified, what the threats in these sites are, and of course, all the available information on the biological features that makes these sites key biodiversity areas. Naturally, if you want to propose a key biodiversity areas, we have made available a set of training material. We have a number of publications, starting foremost with the global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas that was published in 2016. Following this, we published the guidelines on the use of the standard, as well as manuals on how to make the proposals and GIS information on how to treat geographical data for the use in the criteria. We have a series of online training material, 13 PowerPoint presentations, as well as 39 practical exercises that are made available to the wider KBA community. These are particularly intended for national coordination groups that can help your country or your region establish a KBA workforce. And we also have an online training session, training modules that are currently being worked on, which will be potentially available in January. Some of the criteria in the KBA module require information on groups of taxonomic species. There is no need for a proposer that is interested in applying these criteria to go and find information on all biodiversity, as the partnership provides pre-compiled lists and data pertaining to taxonomic groups and their thresholds, as well as lists of range-restricted species, ecoregion-restricted species, and bioregion-restricted species that are necessary for the application of criteria B2 and B3 that look at the taxonomic groups of species and sites. To facilitate the proposal process, we have made a standardized proposal form, which is an Excel spreadsheet with, I believe, 6 sheets in the current version. These will help you by ensuring that all of the data necessary for the proposal of KBAs is captured. It helps you evaluate criteria by telling you which criteria are potentially flagged as you compile the form. And it gives you feedback on which species are triggers as you compile this data. It's also possible for you to receive feedback when you submit this form in the KBA proposal evaluation process, as we will tell you and help you in compiling it so that the information is more robustly inserted into our data structure. Now, while key biodiversity areas are a bottom-up process where the experts on the ground come to us and tell us where the biological features truly are, it can be sometimes useful to take a step back and look at your region from a distance to understand where you're more likely to find key biodiversity areas in your region. We have developed an assessment parameter database and a scoping tool, which currently includes data on 80,000 species. These are all species that are currently mapped in the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, and contains fields for all KBA assessment parameters. You will be able to give us either individual boundaries for sites you're interested in, or provide us with regular grids that cover your region. And we will be able to provide you with information such as which cells potentially are KBAs, which criteria are potentially triggered in each, as well as which species. Here, for example, we see an update on a work that we have previously provided to the Mozambique group, showing where how many species are potentially triggering KBA status in the various regions of the country. And finally, we are working on simplifying some of the processes. The irreplaceability, for example, is irreplaceable sites are sites without which certain targets conservation targets for species cannot be achieved, or that if losing the site means that we lose much of the potential for conserving the species contained within. We have been working on finding a more streamlined process for identifying irreplaceable criteria, including a publication that came out this year. And again, all of the sites that can help you identify KBAs are available through the website and on the website. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele. Now it's my honor to introduce Lise van Staden. She works for the South African National Biodiversity Institute. South Africa is one of these countries that has an amazing spatial conservation plan. They're one of the leaders in spatial conservation planning around the world. They've just taken their data, which includes thousands and thousands of species, and developed and looked at KBAs within their country and how they contribute to that plan. So I'm honored to introduce Lise. Welcome. Can we get sound?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, shall I start again? Thank you, Andy, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. So we've done a lot of work over the past 3 years to map key biodiversity areas in South Africa, and I will just explain to you a little bit more how we did that in my presentation. So next slide, please. So first, just a brief reminder of South Africa's biodiversity profile. It is one of 17 megadiverse countries and known for its high levels of species richness and endemism, particularly plants. And we also have 3 of the world's biodiversity hotspots in our country, one which is entirely confined to the country. Next slide, please. So as Andy said, in South Africa, we regularly do national assessments of the status of our biodiversity, with our 3rd national biodiversity assessment completed in 2018. And this process has catalyzed the mapping of ecosystems across terrestrial, freshwater, estuarine, and marine realms, as well as comprehensive national red list assessments for 8 species groups. Red lists of ecosystem assessments have also been completed according to the IUCN red list of ecosystem criteria for most of our ecosystems. And so this data that we actually already have available in South Africa is readily applicable to KBA criteria, which meant that South Africa was able to be an early adopter of the recently revised KBA standard, and also thoroughly test the performance of the criteria in a real-world megadiverse context. Next slide, please. And we also, in the country, have a strong community of practice around mapping biodiversity priorities, called the Biodiversity Planning Forum, which has been meeting annually for the past 17 years. And so we were able to tap into the collective expertise, practical experience, and knowledge of this community for our national KBA assessment. Our national approach to both assessment and mapping of biodiversity priorities is to do it comprehensively and systematically. And our standard method is systematic conservation planning, which uses targets for species, ecosystems, and ecological process to identify areas that are need to be maintained in a natural or near natural condition to enable the persistence of these biodiversity features. And so we actually already have a national map of biodiversity priorities, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen here. But we decided to explore mapping KBAs as well because it is often the standard in international biodiversity indicators and reporting. It is a common currency by which we can profile our biodiversity internationally and is often linked to funding. And we also wanted to see how KBAs could enhance our existing biodiversity priority map. Next slide, please. But KBAs are, of course, completely different to systematic conservation planning, being a criteria-based system and being focused on identifying individual sites. So it required quite a different approach to what we are used to and experienced in. We still wanted to follow our established practice of doing a comprehensive systematic national assessment using all our available data on potential triggers, including ecosystems. And we also wanted to apply all the criteria where possible. But as you can see, this is similar to Danielle's map. We've started at first at just looking where in our country do we have potential triggers. We put it all together and we found that almost everywhere in the country, there are potential triggers present. So the first big challenge was, where do you even start? So next, please. Yeah, so what we did is we fell back on our habits as conservation planners and used a regular hexagonal grid. And then we tested each of the potential triggering elements against each of the criteria within each grid cell. It is a technically very complicated process, and it's also not an ideal solution because different biodiversity elements are not all likely to trigger criteria at the same spatial scale. But we thought that this approach should at least catch most of the important areas as a first pass, which we could then later augment by other means if necessary. Next slide, please. So this is then the results of this first grid-based pass. And as you can see, very large parts of the country triggered one or more KBA criteria, even at this relatively fine scale. And so we now know where do we have triggering elements that meet criteria, but this is of course not yet a KBA network. We still have to delineate individual sites. And that was our second big challenge. Next, please. So there's very few areas of the country where we actually have like quite discrete areas of importance for biodiversity, like you can see there in the north of the country. And there it's obviously fairly easy to define sites, but just next, please. Most parts of the country, we had these large continuous areas where we have lots of triggering elements meeting criteria, and in defining sites in these parts of the country were much harder. At first, we tried a semi-automated rule-based GIS process based on recommendations for delineation boundaries from the KBA guidelines. But it produced a very unsatisfactory result, mainly because such a one-size-fits-all approach does not respect the varying spatial scales of biodiversity patterns in the country. Next, please. So then we tried something different, which seemed to work better. And so first we used an old method that's used to classify vegetation communities to identify clusters of grid cells that share similar species. And so this approach ensured that species populations were not unnecessarily split apart by delineation boundaries, particularly for geographically restricted species, which was one of the major problems with the rule-based method. Next, please. So then from there, we used these clusters to identify broad areas within which we could delineate sites. Next, please. And so from there, we went and manually basically refined the boundaries of individual key biodiversity areas for example, to the edges of natural vegetation in fragmented landscapes or other locally sensible landscape features. Next, please. And so thus far, we've identified 293 sites. We're still busy finalizing and checking and cleaning all of our boundaries. But we think it will end up being around 300 sites that we identify. And we thought it would be interesting to look at the spread of criteria met. So we did attempt to apply all the criteria, but for some of the criteria, we were not able to find any sites that either meet the criteria or we did not have suitable data for some of them. We applied the criteria to both ecosystems and species, but you can see that species completely dominate the criteria met. But this is not surprising given the high levels of species endemism in South Africa. Ecosystem criteria were relatively harder to meet than species criteria, mainly because of the higher minimum proportion area thresholds for ecosystems than for species. But for most of our threatened and restricted ecosystems, we did at least identify 1 or 2 sites. Next slide. And so just to conclude, while you enjoy some pictures from our key biodiversity areas in South Africa, just some key lessons from our attempt at mapping KBAs in a megadiverse country. We found a very strong correlation between our known biodiversity priority areas and key biodiversity areas. So even though systematic conservation planning is a very different approach, there were no areas that we consider very important for biodiversity persistence that did not meet KBA criteria. Applying criteria in a megadiverse country is not difficult, but sensibly delineating sites in large continuous areas where there are very high concentrations of triggering elements can be very hard. And then lastly, it is worth investing in mobilizing national data sets for species and ecosystems, as we did through our national biodiversity assessment, because 60% of our KBA sites would not have been identified had we only relied on global data sets. Next, last slide. So just to thank everyone who contributed to this project, particularly the KBA Secretariat, Standards and Appeals Committee and the Technical Working Group for their encouragement and support, and then everybody else in South Africa for funding and support, and as well as all the hard work from our species assessment working groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lise. Okay, we're going to move from South Africa now to Australia. Golomara's recorded a presentation. Sadly, he couldn't be here because, unfortunately, Australia doesn't let its citizens out at the moment. So he's made a short recording about what they're doing across the Australian continent.
Hello, I'm Guribunga from Yaraganji country in Cairns. My name is Golomara. I'm the Secretary of the Key Biodiversity Area National Coordination Group in Australia. This group is chaired by Dr. James Watson. Today we want to talk to you about applying the global standard for area conservation in Australia, a megadiverse country. Australia's National Coordination Group is one of the longest running in the partnership since 2017, and it includes all the global KBA partners active in the country, but also most of our big national environmental NGOs. There's a focus on KBAs as an important conservation tool, not just lines on the map. Nonetheless, we funded the research into the KBA inventory and have been able to use that to increasingly engage the Australian government sector. When we started our KBA work, we didn't start on a blank page, but we had the important bird area network in place, which turns out to have about 2/3 of Australia's threatened species in it. 36 KBAs now have trigger species other than birds. They are represented in blue, and 29 are KBAs in danger of losing their biodiversity values. They are shown in red. Even with over 300 key biodiversity areas, our work is clearly not done, and we're focusing on declaring new KBAs as one answer to the Australian conservation crisis driven by things like invasive species, fire, climate change, habitat loss, you name it. We hope that this will help us increase funding for conservation and the legal protection. The main criteria, in KBA criteria we focus on are A, C, and D. With all our KBA declarations and revisions, it's really important for us to do proper stakeholder engagement that includes Indigenous people, academics, the government, landholders, and other NGOs. So let's look at one example. For criterion A, we focus on the Greater Blue Mountains KBA revision. This area, World Heritage Area, went up in flames during the 2019 and 2020 bushfires. As a result, we've looked at adjusting the boundaries and and trigger species and make it more proof to climate change. So one focus there is to look at the valley floors here in yellow, which have been spared by much of the fires and are an important breeding area for the Regent honeyeater. And yeah, the fires also put a lot of plant species like orchids into peril, so we include them as trigger species as well. Another example for criterion A revision is the Coastal Lake Tropics KBA, where we looked at including threatened ecosystems as a KBA trigger. So criterion A2, the coastal lowland rainforest of the wet tropics is globally threatened and less than 40% remain. While we were doing that, we could also look at the mahogany glider, a threatened mammal species to include. It's a great time to do this now with government momentum really strong. State governments have adopted the KBA, the Key Biodiversity Area standards into their legislation. Australian government is funding the bushfire response, and we are in a review of the environmental laws. For criterion C, we looked at a 5-step approach, best of what's left approach, using standard definitions of ecological integrity. The dark blue identifies sort of the starting points for stakeholder engagement in all of Australia's 37 ecoregions. And now to criterion D. One example for that is the revision of the 6 seabird KBAs in the Great Barrier Reef, which we've revised together with the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, both with a view to set their monitoring priorities for until 2050, but also to help us determine marine key biodiversity areas for monitoring and protection. From the word go, we've really looked at practical KBA conservation. So we've got more than 100 key biodiversity area guardians that report annually on the health of the KBAs. We've got more than 120 community groups involved, 3,500 volunteers, 49,000 hours of conservation. So it's a great movement for their protection. If you want to get further insights into Australian KBAs, visit our keybiodiversityareas.org.au blog or download the annual State of KBAs report. You can also get in touch with us directly at kba@birdlife.org.au. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yolo and the Australian group. We now move on to Canada, where they're also doing a national assessment of key biodiversity areas across a massive country. Chloe DeBiser from Wildlife Conservation Society is going to be telling us about that work. Welcome, Chloe.
Thank you, Andy. And so in presenting our work to identify key biodiversity areas in Canada today, I want to touch on a few points. First, why we're doing this work, what exactly we are doing, how it's being done, and where we are at to date. Next, please. So why identify KBAs in Canada, and how is that relevant to our national conservation targets and international commitments? Next, please. Well, as many countries around the world, Canada is experiencing an important decline in its biodiversity, habitat loss and disturbance being key drivers of this decline. We know that area-based conservation measures can be important tools in addressing these declines, but as Andy pointed out, in many places, the placement of protected areas hasn't always been strategic and paid attention to biodiversity needs. We've seen a bit of a shift, though, in Canada recently, with the federal government's commitment first to Aichi Target 11 and then to 30% protection by 2030. Both commitments recognize the need for quality in addition to quantity of protected areas, and specifically identify KBAs as an important tool to identify high quality sites. As a consequence, KBAs are increasingly seen as a credible, robust tool that captures a diversity of biodiversity values and can inform conservation decisions and actions. And I've spoken specifically to protected areas, but in Canada, there's also much interest in using KBAs for land use planning, as in South Africa, for stewardship and for land indigenous-led conservation. Because of this recognition of KBAs at the global level, there's been a call on all jurisdictions now in Canada to identify their KBAs. So how are we answering this call in Canada, and what are we doing? Canada is a very large country with substantial jurisdictional complexity. And for those reasons, it was essential that our approach be collaborative, comprehensive, and relevant. Next, please. What I mean by collaborative is that all forms of knowledge are welcome to the work of identifying KBAs in Canada. We have a strong focus on outreach and participation from governments, academia, NGOs, and experts, as well as on the involvement of Indigenous knowledge holders throughout the process. This collaboration is really facilitated by an extensive review process that we've put in place for experts and stakeholders. Next, please. The work also is comprehensive, or seeks to be. Much like others have emphasized, we're looking to identify as full a set of KBAs as possible in Canada. This is essential if the output is to be used for land use planning. It means that we come at it from both a species and an ecosystem criteria perspective, as permitted by data availability. Next. We also seek to have a relevant approach, meaning one that is integrated within the Canadian conservation landscape, and specifically within existing conservation processes, institutions, and tools. This is also key to ensuring that the output can be readily integrated into conservation decision-making in Canada. Next, please. So how are we implementing this work? Next. The first aspect I want to highlight is the governance and participation structure that we have that really facilitates the collaboration I was mentioning earlier. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a diagram of our Canadian KBA Coalition, which is really our national coordination group. And you can see that a whole lot of organizations are involved in work, and everyone is really welcome to join the coalition. We also have a steering committee that provides guidance and a secretariat that coordinates the work. The secretariat is made up of 3 organizations: WCS Canada, Birds Canada, and NatureServe Canada. We also have a very active Canadian KBA community made up of governments, experts, and users of information. Next, please. Another aspect of the implementation that is quite unique to Canada is the development of a national KBA standard for Canada. It's an adaptation of the global standard to ensure that the tool is as relevant as possible to the Canadian context. What the national standard does is it uses national, as opposed to global, population sizes and extents to test KBA thresholds. It also incorporates taxa below the species level, which is important for us because many populations and subspecies are of federal importance in Canada. And we also use Canadian ranking systems to assess threat levels within Canada. Next, please. And finally, I think our technical implementation really captures the essence of the work that we're doing. So firstly, we've broken up the work into regional and thematic initiatives. So regionally, we have coordinators. You see where they are based mostly on this map. And they bring in their own networks of experts. They identify data and people, stakeholders, and rights holders. This again ensures that the work is relevant to the local context and as comprehensive as possible. We also have thematic initiatives such as a freshwater systems initiative and an ecosystem initiative. Next, please. We also come at this work from 2 different directions. We conduct bottom-up work that is expert-driven, whereby experts guide us in identifying sites or potential sites. But also, similar to what was presented at the global level, we also have top-down tools that are data-driven analysis that can complement, inform, and guide the bottom-up work. Because we come at this from all these different directions, we also have a centralized, high-capacity Canadian KBA Secretariat that ensures the consistency and the quality of all the work we do. The Secretariat puts in place collaborative data infrastructure, as well as standardized tools and processes. This is obviously substantial work for a very large country, and so we expect it to take about 4 to 5 years, and we expect to have about 900 KBAs by the end of the process. Next, please. So where are we at to date? Next. These are our KBAs that we're proposing for species criteria. So what you're seeing on the map in red are actual candidate sites, and in orange, buffers around the smaller sites, just so you can see them at the national scale. You're seeing about 250 new sites on this map, as well as 450 reassessed important birds and biodiversity areas, as well as Alliance for Zero Extinction sites. Next, please. And here's the taxonomic breakdown of what these sites capture so far. You can see here that there's about 63% of the species we capture are vascular plants, but we also have a good proportion of vertebrates and invertebrates, as well as some non-vascular plants. Next, please. And looking at it in more detail, you'll see here that about 50% of our triggers are dicots, but we also have a bunch of monocots we're capturing, as well as different fish species, mammals, and various insect groups. So this was really neat for us to see that we're grabbing, we have good taxonomic coverage and getting species across the phylogeny. Next, please. When it comes to ecosystem types, we're in a more preliminary stage. We call it the scoping or screening stage. What you're seeing on the map here are 22 tentative KBAs for endangered prairie ecosystems, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're starting work in British Columbia, in Ontario, and in Nova Scotia for endangered forest ecosystems. Next, please. When it comes to criterion C, what you're seeing on the map here is also screening work, so early work showing areas of high ecological integrity based on a coarse grain analysis that includes factors such as human footprint, hydrological connectivity, and road networks. Within these sites, we're then going to have to go in and delineate actual KBAs using regional data sets and traditional knowledge. So we expect to have about 50 criterion C KBAs by the end of this work, which is quite exceptional and very exciting for Canada. Next, please. And to wrap up, I just thought we'd travel to a few of these sites, just to hopefully get you excited about Canadian biodiversity and get you a sense a bit of what they look like. Next, please. This is Ivavik National Park in Yukon, so the northwestern corner of Canada. And we're proposing it as a KBA for a range of species, including caribou, several plant species, and the straight-line dogea, which is a moth. Next, please. We're also quite excited about Sable Island off the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia. It's this crescent-shaped island made up of sand dunes, and it is a center of endemism. We have 5 endemics there, including a sweat bee, 3 moths, and a leaf beetle. And it also is a KBA under D1 for the gray seal. Next, please. And finally, the Fraser River Estuary in the Vancouver area in British Columbia is actually, historically has been an important bird and biodiversity area for a host of birds that you can see on this slide. But with the KBA initiative, we've been able to add 2 very neat triggers to this site, the killer whale and the Georgia Basin bog spider, which is a highly geographically restricted spider. So I hope this gives you a taste for the wide variety of sites we're identifying in Canada and a sense of how rich the KBA tool is already proving to be for us. And to wrap up, I just want to thank all the people who are making this work possible, the Canadian KBA Secretariat, our KBA coordinators, the conservation data centers that provide information, as well as the many, many KBA advisors, experts, and reviewers who make this work possible. Next slide. I just wanted to invite you all to visit our website if you would like to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chloe. So finally, we're coming to the country of Mozambique. And Mozambique has also gone through a comprehensive assessment of its key biodiversity areas. Unfortunately, they couldn't be here again because of COVID, so they've also sent a video.
Hello everyone, I am Hermenegildo Matimel. I'm with the Lottery Duarte, Nasiba Sadat and Boston. We're going to present to you the results of the KBAs project in Mozambique, which was led by WCS Mozambique, working closely with the Ministry of Land and Environment in Mozambique. Our presentation is going to focus on the establishment of the NCG. We'll take you through the steps to engage, how did we engage with several stakeholders, and we'll give you an overview on how did we integrate the results into the national plans. Starting point was to interact with the National Directorate of Environment, which is under the Ministry of Land and Environment. This entity is the entity that oversees several international conventions on biodiversity. So it was found to be suitable for that reason. And we engaged with this department to discuss which institution should be part of the NCG. We aligned the NCG with a number of initiatives that were in place already. Then we reached an agreement that the NCG would work on KBAs initiatives, but also on the red listing initiatives of species and ecosystems. So it includes several institutions, from governmental institutions, NGOs, research institutes, academia, private sector. So those institutions are part of the NCG. We had several meetings with all those institutions to discuss the steps that should be taken into consideration, including who should be the president. So the NCG is hosted within the National Directorate of Environment because of the reasons that I explained before, that is the institution overseeing international convention, and also it's under the Ministry of Land and the Environment, which is the ministry that oversees biodiversity matters in the country. Having established the MCG, we moved on defining biodiversity elements and also mobilized the data, engaging with over 100 experts regionally and internationally, but also engaging with several institutions. We applied the KBA criteria. We identified, we came up with 41 proposals, and those proposals were submitted to the National Coordination Group to evaluate. They evaluated those proposals, and 30 were in condition to proceed to the regional KBA focal point, which is Daniel Manwick. Then they were sent to the KBA Secretariat, and they got published. So as a result of this process, we have 29 KBAs, of which 4 are marine and 25 are terrestrial. This was an inclusive process. So we had an assessment across different taxonomy groups, as you can see from this graph. It's clearly showing several number of taxonomy groups that we worked with. For that reason, this is one of the most comprehensive assessment of any country so far, with the plants being the majority, followed by reptiles, as a result of number of initiatives that have been taken place recently. With the results, we had an official event to launch those results, which was led by the Ministry of Land and the Environment. She's the second lady from the left to the right on the front row, or is the third person, if you like. Having the results, we worked on integrating those results into national legislation and spatial plans. KBAs got integrated in the National Territorial Development Plan as areas that should be avoided by development projects. And also KBAs got integrated in the ongoing National Marine Spatial Planning. We also integrate KBAs in the ongoing offsets ministerial diploma as areas that also to be avoided. KBAs are recognized as protection areas for birds and their habitats in the new decree for the protection, conservation, and sustainable use of birds and their habitats, which was approved in July this year. In terms of next steps, the project COM is still ongoing, so it's going to contribute to continue working on identifying those areas that were shortlisted as KBAs. It will continue on ongoing work on producing a map of ecosystems and also identify areas for restoration. The there is any regional project which will include South Africa, Namibia, Malawi, and Mozambique. This project is going to support red listing initiatives, definition of national contributions to the 2030 targets, and also support training to the governmental officers. So those are some of the initiatives. As I said, we're still working on the map of the ecosystems. So this is a preliminary results of the map, which we produce, and also the red listing of those ecosystems. And we are also producing a new biodiversity portal for Mozambique, which is going to be the home for all the information that we have generated as part of the KBA project, and the information that will be generated as part of the other initiatives in Mozambique. We would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you to Hermenegildo Matimele from Mozambique. So that finishes the presentations for the countries. Now we're going to hear from the private sector about how they're using key biodiversity areas. And I'm grateful to Conrad Savvy, who's a regional lead for the International Finance Corporation, who's going to talk to us about how they're using KBAs. Welcome, Conrad.
Hi, Andy. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, great. I can't see my slides yet. That's coming up.
We're seeing it up here, but...
Okay, I can see the whole room now. I feel like I'm in the back of the hall. Excellent. Hi, everybody. And first off, thank you for the invitation to speak today. You know, it's always a pleasure discussing KBAs. And again, I like to, just scan the audience. A lot of my close friends I see sitting in the audience who've worked on KBAs over the years. I actually began some of my career spent with Conservation International in the early days of developing the KBA standards. So great to see where it's come after all this time. So very, very exciting stuff from the various countries listed. I now find myself sitting within the International Finance Corporation, a very odd place for a biologist to be. And I'm just going to basically go through, just what is IFC, how do we use KBAs, and just some reflections of how we've used them and what we learned from them in the time we've been applying KBAs within the context of our investments. Next slide, please. So what is the IFC? It's not uncommon that many in the NGO and conservation community have never heard of the IFC. I think that is changing slowly. We are actually part of the World Bank group, so most people are aware of our big sister, the World Bank. But we're within that group of organizations. We are focused on private sector investment. So we are the largest development organization focused on private sector development investment. Our portfolio last year was around $75 billion. So it's fairly significant. But I think what's interesting about IFC is that investment flows through a very specific lens of our safeguards, what we call our performance standards. And these are them, the 8 performance standards. And you'll see they cover a range of issues from health and safety type things, labor, quite a big focus on community and social issues. So you see indigenous peoples featuring, land resettlement issues, cultural heritage. But hidden within those 8 standards is performance standard 6 on biodiversity conservation. And that means that pretty much, most or all IFC investments are being applied in a way that's trying to avoid impacts to biodiversity and where possible actually enhance biodiversity values. Now, we all know IFC is not the only investor in the world. There are many others, and we're again amazed to see again with whether that's good or bad, it's up to you. But what we're seeing is that many of our peers in the finance community, within governments, and also in the private sector, in terms of some of the large companies and industry associations, have either directly picked up our standards or are aligning very closely with them. And I think this goes to Andy's point initially about, you can say 17% of areas to be conserved, but it matters what you're conserving. And it's great seeing that the conservation community is aligning around what important biodiversity is. And what's nice is that now within the private sector and development organizations, we are increasingly aligning around the same definitions you're using. And again, that's driven through, I think IUCN's role as a bit of a standard setter and consensus builder around those standards for species, for sites, protected area categorization, and now ecosystems also. Next slide, please. But how do we use key biodiversity areas? There's basically two buckets of approach. So one is in our formal policy and guidance. So within PS6 itself and the associated guidance, we treat KBAs the same as legally protected areas. And that's just a recognition that not all important places are protected. There are many important places that present very high biodiversity risk that are not protected. These are, and KBAs are a good example of that. And so we treat them with the same level of effort and concern in terms of the need to demonstrate legality of overlap, the need to engage stakeholders managing those areas, the need to align with management plans for those areas. The second key policy item there is that, biodiversity is complex. We try and make it simple and from a risk management perspective. And so we put biodiversity into three simple buckets: modified habitats, natural habitats, and occurring in either of those, critical habitats. So really the highest risk, the tip of the iceberg elements of biodiversity concern. And what we've done there is, again, since around 2012, increasingly aligning our definition and thresholds for critical habitat around the KBA thresholds. So that now, our most recent guidance, if you pick that up, you'll see in some cases word for word, cut and paste for some of the KBA criteria where they align with our existing policy objectives. And again, that's also helped us in terms of not just having a scientific basis for our thresholds around critical habitat, but also, I'll come back to this later, but the fact that these are now linked to actual data, actual networks, actual partnerships that we can leverage to do our work better on critical habitat. And then finally, in terms of, again, one subset of KBAs, the Alliance for Zero Extinction Sites, the AZE sites, those have been now flagged within our guidance in terms of areas particularly to be avoided for investment, except where you can demonstrate those investments are designed for conservation. We, again, treat UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the same way. And so, again, KBAs are not just giving us, in their own right, important places, also informing our definition, but now as far as we can get towards a no-go statement, they're informing that too. And just one point to make is the reason we don't have a no-go statement is just the diversity of sectors that IFC invests in, which includes things like ecotourism. And so, if we had to step away from ecotourism and even some carbon offset projects, having a no-go would actually stop us going into those places. And so, again, we have a more nuanced approach to that. But in terms of practice, that's the policy and guidance piece that's written down, but what's the actual practice around KBAs? And so, beyond that, generally, we see KBAs as indicators of natural habitat. It's not always true, but it's one of the best things we have. And also just in general biodiversity risk. So even if a KBA is not hitting critical habitat criteria, at the various earlier stages of our investment and our screening, they are flagging important places to be very cautious about. And I think the other practice that we've picked up, and again, not in our policy or guidance, but we've really benefited from this, is that KBA partners, so the people who actually define KBAs locally, are often our first stop in terms of engagement, because those are often the national or local experts who've not only just mapped KBAs, but often we find are tapped into conservation issues locally, nationally, often have the highest capacity around conservation biodiversity management, and are people who can help us, again, not just deal with KBA issues, but just general biodiversity risk management issues, designing surveys, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. So just I've been asked to give some reflections on lessons learned and how KBAs are helping the private sector think about the post-2020 framework. I think the first point, again, goes back to what I talked about just now, and again, Andy's point about, KBAs cut through the noise. They give us a common signal of what is important for biodiversity. And it really helps us focus our attention around not just protected area targets, but also the fact that lenders, financiers, and the private sector can also use the same definition, the same objectives around KBAs to drive our biodiversity approaches, both in terms of avoiding risks and damages and potential opportunistic or opportunities in terms of proactive investment in biodiversity. And so the fact they cut through that noise, I think, helps us both on both sides to come to a common consensus, common objectives that, again, I think have a lot of hope for the post-2020 framework. The more we have a common currency for biodiversity importance, the more we all pull the same direction. I think the second thing we've picked up is yes, KBAs are global and their standards and their thresholds, but ultimately they're local. We've just seen now from South Africa, Canada, Mozambique about how these are very homegrown institutions and structures and stakeholders defining KBAs for local needs, which is great, but also gives us significant global consistency across the globe, which again helps our work as an international organization. We can go to any particular country, we can hear about KBAs and generally know that, yes, they're locally owned, there are stakeholders behind them, but we can treat them the same in pretty much every country, given the consistency around the thresholds and criteria. I've got in brackets here when done right, because there are examples, I think mostly older KBAs, and we still see it now and again, KBAs defined perhaps in, again, no insult to anybody, but KBAs defined in Cambridge or Washington, DC or Switzerland. And those are the ones where we have issues, where you find these large blobs in a map that don't represent the realities on the ground. And so again, I think one lesson learned is the strongest KBAs where there is a real local ownership and involvement in those KBAs. Again, the examples I'm seeing from Mozambique and South Africa and Canada, I think are the way things should be going more, not less. The third thing is KBAs are transparent. It really helps us to be able to go to a place and be told it's important, and we can say why. It's for this particular species, this particular ecosystem. And again, unfortunately, things do change on the ground, and allows us to actually confirm to say, are those things still relevant? Have they gotten worse or better for this particular KBA, and to really interrogate those KBAs and understand why they're important, and also to tailor our mitigation responses much better, knowing what the key objectives of that KBA are. Fourth point here is about, again, I've made the point about KBAs help us find partners and experts. It's really easy to find a bird life partner. Now the KBA partnership, I'm probably calling Andy once a month about a KBA-related project. It's really great having partners we can call up and find and talk to about these things. The one thing we've learned is how many partners and experts don't know their full power. Many local constituents around KBAs are into the conservation objective. They've developed the KBAs, but they're often surprised that KBAs have such strong links to many of the finance safeguards, and not just IFC, as I mentioned. So there's an element there of perhaps the need for many of the local partners to fully understand the strength of KBAs, and particularly AZEs in terms of driving development and protecting important places, because these are, again, increasingly taken very seriously by financiers. Next point, again, KBAs are accessible. Again, many data sets are sitting locally. They're hard to reach until quite late in the investment cycle. KBAs we're accessing from day one, again, thanks to IBAT and all their good work, which is unusual for such site-level data. It really helps our work. Next point is, again, this is a negative, but something we picked up, and again, maybe it's a signal to government to think about and our local partners to think about. But we often find KBAs can be ignored by local permitting processes. That applies to legally protected areas too. So it's not a KBA-specific problem, but it's something that puts us in a tough position where we come with, we're trying to link to international standards and approaches. The national partners often are there, but then you've got governments who don't quite understand it or are still giving out concession licenses that overlap those areas. And again, there's a bit of work to try and bring in government buy-in, or again, I think it's happening, but probably speed it up. And the last point is, again, KBAs are written to a lot of guidance now. There's a strong consensus of their importance among the private sector. But that strong business case can be undermined by KBA data quality and currency. And again, I acknowledge, Andy's point about, this needs funding. And I know that many of the partners or private sector users are effectively, paying IBAT to access the data in some way, hopefully some of that gets back to the KBA partnership and support. But I think this is something, I think on one hand, you've got to think about the guidance that you write about KBAs has to recognize that we are still a work in progress. There is data that's out of date that needs to be improved. On the other side of things, there's probably a challenge to the user community, and I look at private sector and development banks particularly, about how do we actually bring back the value we're enjoying from KBAs to actually keep those data sets current and up to scratch. And so there's probably a big discussion I know it's been having for a while. I know, Andy, we discuss this quite a lot, but how does the KBA partnership capture the value that's being realized by the private sector in using these data for better decision making? Next slide, please. And just a last point, again, this goes to the importance of the KBA networks in the local partners, is that many financiers disclose their projects. IFC, for example, has a public disclosure portal. It can be a bit difficult to use, I won't lie about that, but happy to discuss that with you. But the key thing is we do disclose our projects before we commit to investment. And in those disclosures, if there's a KBA involved, we mention it. And so I'm always surprised how little comment we get from the NGO community, KBA partners, about projects in their countries where KBAs are adjacent to or being overlapped by a project. And so, I think a request, and it helps help me do my job better, is when KBA partners look at those disclosures and raise questions about projects in or near KBAs. Thank you, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Conrad. So that's the end of our presentations. We're now going to move to the panel discussion, and I'll hand over to Melanie Heath. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you very much to all of our speakers in the first part of that session. My name is Melanie Heath. I'm Global Director for Science and Policy and Information with BirdLife International. My task is to moderate our short panel that will take us through to the end of the session today. And we've heard, I think so far, some really key messages coming through there. Firstly, the tremendous progress, and really exciting to bring these key biodiversity areas to life. The strength of a unified voice in terms of these are the important places for biodiversity on the planet. The strength of using a common standard, really building on existing approaches around important bird and biodiversity areas, Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, critical ecosystem partnership fund sites, all of those came through in the national presentations that we heard there. And I think really importantly, the essence of these national driven processes being so critically important, really founded in localness and the approach of national identification. But we're going to move now from that identification, building on some of the speakers' points, particularly Conrad's experience in terms of the IFC and how the KBA information and data are being used, to think a little bit more about how KBAs are contributing to conservation outcomes, and particularly looking at the implementation of outcomes potentially under the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which we're hearing a lot about at this Congress here in Marseille. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, my colleague Ed Ellis, who is the manager of the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, IBAT, which Conrad referred to there in his presentation. And I wonder, Ed, if you might build a little bit further on Conrad's reflections and talk about how the KBA data are being used and your thoughts on how the private sector can access the information on key biodiversity areas and how. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel. The short answer to the second part of your question around how the private sector can access KBA data is through IBAT. And as Conrad mentioned, it is used by a number of the financial institutions that are particularly around the public development banks, but IBAT has a much larger reach as well across the private sector through extractives organizations, through financial organizations, everything from agricultural companies and pharmaceutical organizations as well. IBAT, or the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, is a web-based mapping and reporting tool that provides fast, easy, and crucially integrated access to critical biodiversity information. And this is in the form of not just the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas, but also the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species and the World Database on Protected Areas. Much like the KBA partnerships, IBAT is an alliance between 4 global conservation organizations in the form of IUCN, BirdLife International, Conservation International, and the United Nations Environment Programme's World Conservation Monitoring Center. And these organizations came together under a common vision that decisions affecting critical biodiversity should be informed by the best and most up-to-date scientific information, and that the organizations who make use of that information should help support both its generation and its maintenance. So the private sector, through IBAT, is able to access information around key biodiversity areas through the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas. And because this is a global database, you might recall the map that Andy showed earlier, where you could see there's key biodiversity areas all around the world. These are being used to inform commercial decision-making around the world. Through IBAT, we have over 8,000 users across over 100 of the world's largest institutions, informing commercial decisions in over 228 countries and territories around the world. And this is predominantly around managing risk. IBAT is an early stage, high-level risk screening platform where organizations are able to understand the proximity of their projects to areas of high conservation value, such as key biodiversity areas and areas that have been defined by either national or international legislation as protected. And this is a really important point. Once the private sector is able to understand where their projects are and how near or far they are from areas of high biodiversity value, they're able to apply what's called the mitigation hierarchy to reduce the impact that they have on nearby areas of high conservation value and avoid these sites being degraded. As Conrad mentioned, the IFC use key biodiversity areas, and they've really set the bar for how the finance sector in particular accesses and thinks about key biodiversity areas. And we actually partnered with World Bank Group specialists to develop a specific type of report to help the early rollout of IFC's Performance Standard 6. But it's not just the finance sector, it's used by businesses across a number of different sectors to really help inform decisions. If people don't know where key biodiversity areas are, they can't help but, they can't mitigate the impacts they might have on these sites. I'll leave it there because we do have 3 other panelists who I'd like to get to, but thank you very much, Mel.
Thank you so much, Ed. Really, really helpful. And if anyone would like more information about IBAT and how it's working, do come and see Ed at the end of the session. I'd like to turn next, please, if we could pass the mic along, that would be great, to Edwoge Abwe, who is the manager of the Igbo Forest Research Project in Cameroon. And I wonder if you might tell us a little bit, please, Edwoge, a little bit more about how, once a site has received that KBA identification, that KBA status, such as Igbo Forest, how that's really helped in the conservation of the site. Thank you.
Thank you. So as you said, I work in the Igbo Forest Research Project in Cameroon, but the Igbo Forest falls within what we call the Yabasi Key Biodiversity Area, which is a forest in the Gulf of Guinea. And this Guinea rainforest, and this ecoregion, is actually so limited in terms of, how much area it covers. So the Yabasi Key Biodiversity Area is one of the most important forest tract, which still harbors a lot of the species that once characterized this whole area. And in this area, we've been working since 2002, when a small population of gorillas was discovered in the area. The area also harbors chimpanzees, forest elephants, a wide range of primate species and large mammals. But also more important is the plant diversity. From 2005 to date, more than 30 new species of have been discovered in this forest. And the forest enjoys no protected status apart from being a key biodiversity area. So what we've been doing all along is working with the local communities to conserve these forests. And this has been going on because the communities take pride in, owning, I'll put it that way, this rich biodiversity, most of which is unique and found nowhere else. And this has been, going on really well. The communities have this sort of pride because there used to be villages inside what is called the Yabase Key Biodiversity Area, but these populations were relocated in 1963 around the Cameroon independence due to insecurity. So they still have that sort of cultural and spiritual attachment to the forest. Then it came in 2020 that the government of Cameroon decided to create logging concessions within the southern part of the Yabase Key Biodiversity Area, that is the Ebo Forest. And the communities rose up like one man, like, no, this cannot happen. This will mean cutting down the forest, which represents our livelihood, cutting down the forests which represent our ancestral homes. And these communities were joined by a wide range of stakeholders in Cameroon and abroad. There was a real upswell of this, campaign against this project. And the government did not back down immediately. The decree creating the logging concessions was actually signed in July 7th of July, but the pressure carried on. The local communities were able to go as far as the Presidency of the Republic to push their case through. And finally, in August, they got what they needed. The decree was suspended, and that was such a big relief to these communities. Though the area still enjoys no protected status, the communities are still there, taking pride in what they have. And so, yes, key biodiversity areas can actually play a big role in, conserving our rich biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful and very hard-earned example of the work by the local communities to achieve the continued conservation of the area. Thank you so much. I'd then like to bring us to our third panelist, Pedro Sebastião, who is Head of Protection for Natural Resource Department, which is Mozambique's national agency on protected areas. And we had that wonderful presentation on Mozambique a little bit earlier. And I wonder if you might say a little bit more, building on those reflections, please, Pedro, about how Mozambique Agency will take this work further forward on KBAs. Thank you so much.
Well, I think I will start by just mentioning something that I took from the presentation. It was from the last presenter. And he said that KBAs are local, but also global. And I want to agree with that and have other presenters have clarified here during the presentation. We have started with a bottom-up approach. We brought so many stakeholders on board. We brought the private sector, the public sector, academia, and so on. And I think the process was so positive. And as the government, we have in mind that this is not the end, but it is just a start of a long process, which now we have to use the information that we have. If we go back to the presentation, we managed to identify 29 KBAs, and several species have been identified. The levels of threats are already known, and we want to use this information for the benefit of our protected areas network. And we want to increase the percentage of network, of the protected network that we already have. Just for you to have an idea, we have so far 25% of the entire country under a certain level of protection. Not certain level, but under protected. It means 25% have been declared as a protected area, either by marine or terrestrial protected area. So we will use the information that was produced during the KBA assessment to contribute to increase this protected areas network. And of course, it is aligned with the AICI targets, but now we look forward for the 2030 goals. I think this is a very interesting starting point. So I believe that we are at least one step ahead, and we can use this information in our favor. And again, apart from just using this information to declare new protected areas, of course, they will not have the same level of protection. We will have to assess exactly, according to the threats and the vulnerability, we have to apply the appropriate category. But we will also use this to integrate these proposed vital areas for biodiversity conservation into the national territory development plan, which is almost near to be finalized. And apart from this spatial planning, we also have recently finished the zoning, the consultation process for the marine spatial planning. And I think most of the information that also have been produced for the marine environment will also be used to make a better planning of the sea area. So by having said that, I will also encourage some other countries. Of course, our brothers from South Africa, they have gone through it and very well, and I would like to also encourage the other neighboring countries to adopt this KBA's initiative to strengthen conservation of biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pajul, and fantastic for mentioning also the marine environment. We haven't talked about that too much during the session this afternoon, but clearly key biodiversity areas across terrestrial and marine environments are absolutely critical. And as well, sort of mentioning that integration within the national development plans and protected areas and other area-based measures. So moving from that, I'd really like to introduce Penny Langhammer, who is the Executive Vice President with Rewild. And Penny, we've heard from an increasing number of countries who are using, identifying, and beginning to use the KBAs, as well as the private sector. And I wonder if you might give us a little bit more insight into why we believe it is so critical that that approach, key biodiversity areas, are a component of the evolving post-biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I'll try to be very brief. KBAs need explicit mention in the global biodiversity framework and to form a key indicator for tracking progress, because without this, there will be ambiguity about which sites are of particular importance for biodiversity and that should be conserved. And we have evidence of this from the past decade. As Andy showed, between 2010 and 2020, the expansion of protected areas was biased toward locations that were not areas of global importance for species and ecosystems, and we expect that trend would likely continue over the next decade. It's important to highlight that KBAs currently only cover 9% of the terrestrial surface of the planet and much less in the marine realm. That's largely due to just we're behind in KBA identification for the marine realm, but clearly as countries work to achieve the 30 by 30 target, KBAs represent the minimum of what needs to be protected or conserved. Other areas will certainly be needed, and that's made clear in our recommended language for Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, especially key biodiversity areas and other areas of particular importance for biodiversity. Another thing I'd like to highlight is that once countries identify and map their other effective area-based conservation measures, it will be clear that many countries have met and in some cases exceeded the 30 by 30 target without protecting or conserving any additional area, including in particular key biodiversity areas, and may rest on their laurels. That's certainly not the intention of Target 3, nor what we need to address the biodiversity crisis. The quality elements of Aichi Target 11, and I'm concerned for the Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, tend to get ignored. The aerial coverage target or portion of Target 11 was the only part that was achieved. And when we abbreviate the target, we talk about 30 by 30, not the most important 30 by 30. And so those quality elements will be forgotten. And then finally, 40% of key biodiversity areas are entirely outside of protected areas, and 42% only have partial coverage. And many of these, of the world's KBAs haven't even been identified yet. And if we don't ensure that these sites are specifically targeted for effective protection and conservation as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework, there's no doubt that we will fail in our efforts to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. So we really need ambition from governments, NGOs, donors, and the private sector to really scale up the identification and conservation of these of KBAs so that all countries have mapped and protected or conserved these sites as they work to meet the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Penny. That was really helpful and informative, and that is a huge topic we appreciate. So very few minutes at the end, and sorry about that in terms of covering that really important element of integration of KBAs and their reflection within the Global Biodiversity Framework. We are at time, so I think it leaves me really to say thank you to all of our speakers, to those that have joined online, to all our panelists here today. And I hope what we've been able to do is really share with you more information about how and why KBAs are so important. And we've heard some great examples from many countries in terms of how we're going about identifying those sites, but also how they're translating into conservation and conservation practice on the ground and being embedded within protected area and conserved area approaches. Where you might find the information, the data, if you'd like to learn more, through the KBA website and the World Database on KBAs, and how the data are being used by governments, by the private sector, and by others. And importantly, that local, national-driven approach involving local communities and indigenous peoples in the process. So I think really that leaves me to thank everybody, to say on behalf of the KBA Partnership, there are several other KBA partners here. I can see my friends and colleagues from RUCN, from NatureServe also in the room today. Thank you so much for being here. And if you'd like to learn anything more about KBAs, do come and talk to any of the panelists or click on any of the links that you've seen in the presentation today. Thank you so much for being part of the discussion, and we wish you all a pleasant rest of your day. Thank you.